And I hope we need to go to part 2. What a blessing to see you this morning, and I hope that you've had a good week and a good 4th of July. And I started on this sermon topic or subject, and I really didn't expect this to go this long, but the more I've kind of dug into this, the more I've realized things I'd missed, and I just kind of got chasing a bunch of different rabbits down a bunch of different holes. And you know, it's something we think about a lot, isn't it? The crucifixion of Jesus, the garden, the scourging. We've probably, a lot of us have seen the movie, The Passion of the Christ, or other movies related to that. It's something as Christians we sometimes dwell upon, especially around Easter and other times. We think about that. We take communion. We think about the death of Jesus. You know, but the deal about Scripture and the Bible is the Bible's not a once upon a time story. It's not a once upon a time in a land far away. The Bible's a real story about real people, real events, things that actually happened. And sometimes the story of the crucifixion is something that really exemplifies that very idea. It's something we see not only biblically, we see historically, we see in other references of literature besides the Bible. The idea of this Jesus of Nazareth, this Jesus who was crucified upon a cross. The story of how that happened and how those events unfolded. It's a story that is sometimes a little bit confusing in the Bible. If you read through it synoptically, you read through and you think, well, this seems a little different than over here. Things don't maybe seem to line up sometimes, and sometimes maybe we haven't looked at it that deeply. I remember as a child, I would hear this story. I would hear somebody read it out of a certain gospel, out of Matthew or out of John, and maybe not look at the overall picture of things that were going and the significance of those events. You know, under the Passover, under Judaism, when they would do the Passover feast and the Passover lamb, they would take that lamb in on the 10th of the month, and they would sacrifice that lamb on the 14th day of the month. There was 4 days in there. 4 days they would observe that lamb to make sure that lamb was perfect and without blemish and without disease or defect. And then they would sacrifice that lamb that had been examined for those 4 days. In the case of Jesus, he went before 4 different people after he was arrested in the garden. Last week we talked a little bit about Annas, the high priest, the former high priest, Caiaphas, the current high priest. We looked some at the denial of Peter, his denial of Jesus 3 times about the rooster crowing. And now, today, we need to look at the other 2 people that he went before. 4 times, right? Annas, Caiaphas, Pilate, and Herod. The 4 inspections of Jesus, or 4 people that Jesus went before on his journey to the cross. You know, Jesus, it said that morning, and Matthew says that, and then the morning after, right? In the morning. And I don't know what that means to you, what morning means to you. You know, morning means to me, I don't know, 10 or 11 o'clock. But, you know, some people think morning is like when the sun comes up. Personally, I don't like being up to observe that, but I mean, you know, that's the time, that's morning, right? And so you think, you know, what is that in Judaism? What exactly were they talking about here? And we're going to have to talk about that just a little bit. In Matthew 27:1, Matthew says, "A morning came, all the chief priests and the elders of the people conferred together against Jesus to put him to death." Now in Matthew, talks about, the first thing he talks about in Matthew 27 is about Judas coming and throwing the money at the feet and being remorseful, and the priest dealing with that. And then it talks about going to Pilate. Now, and one of the interesting things as you put these together is that in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and the Synoptics, it says Jesus was crucified about the 3rd hour. Now, in Judaism, that's about 9 o'clock in the morning. Now, in John, it says Pilate pronounced his sentence at the 6th hour. Now, in Judaism, the 6th hour would be noon. So that really doesn't line up very well, does it? If John says they pronounced the sentence at noon, or it's in the 6th hour, and Matthew, Mark, and Luke say that he was crucified on the 3rd hour, that really doesn't line up very well. I mean, it doesn't really make sense. And so most people think that John was talking about Roman time, when Romans kept time like we keep time. Romans kept time from from midnight on. So the 6th hour in John would be about 6 o'clock in the morning. So when you think about that, that's how early all of this took place. So I looked up. I was just curious, thinking about all this, how this worked. And so, we know when Jesus was crucified. We more or less know that date, that time in history. So I Googled that. When was daylight? When was daybreak when Jesus was crucified? And according to Google, Google never lies. According to Google, it said that daylight when Jesus was crucified was about 5:30 to 5:45 a.m. I do not want to live in that part of the world. I'm telling you right now. 5:30 to 5:45 a.m. And a lot of times in Judaism, they considered daylight 70 minutes before that. So when he says morning in Matthew, we're talking about really, really, really early morning, because apparently what scholars think, they wanted to get these trials out of the way before the masses more or less become awake, before they more or less woke up and become aware of what was going on. They wanted to try to push this thing through quickly. So the events we talk about this morning are going to happen in a really short period of time, from about maybe 5:30 in the morning up until about 8 o'clock or so in the morning. So this happened fairly fast, this shuffling between. And the first thing that Jesus did, the first thing they took him was to Pilate. Now, Pilate was the proconsul, or governor of Judea. Now, in order to understand that a little bit, you kind of got to understand Herod the Great. Herod the Great, there were 4 people after Herod the Great. We call them the tetrarchs. And then these tetrarchs took control of all Herod's territory. Herod Archelaus was the one who had control of Judea. He was a very mean, very cruel person, very bloody. And because of that, he was disposed by Rome in about 10 AD. So by the time that Jesus went to Pilate, which is in the 30s, by the time Jesus went to Pilate, he was no longer there, and Judea was being ruled by Pilate, by a proconsul. That's how come we have Pilate. And that was Pilate's authority. Pilate had the authority of Rome. And we know this because the Jews couldn't sentence a man to death. And they needed Jesus to die. And Jesus has already said, I'm going to die on a cross. Romans are the only ones that could do that. So after we go to these 2 priests, we go to Annas, we looked at that last Sunday morning, and Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin at Caiaphas' house. Now we're going to go to Pilate. And that's in Luke 23. The whole body of them got up and brought him before Pilate. The whole body here meaning the Sanhedrin, meaning all of those that were persecuting him. And they began to accuse him. We found this man misleading our nation and forbidding to pay taxes and saying he himself is Christ a king. And so Pilate asked him, saying, you are the king of the Jews. And he answered them, it is as you say. Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, I find no guilt. But they kept on insisting, saying, he stirs up the people, teaching all over Judea, starting from Galilee, even as far as this place. When Pilate heard it, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. And when he learned that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, see, this is where it gets a little confusing, doesn't it? So I already told you, Herod Archelaus was over Judea, but he was disposed. And then we had Philip that was over part of that region. And then we had Salome the first, who was over part of that region. And then we had Herod Antipas. Herod Antipas was Herod's son. And Herod Antipas was over Galilee. Now Jesus, as we know, was from Galilee. He was from Nazareth. That's in Galilee. He probably lived in Capernaum at the time he started his ministry, which is on the Sea of Galilee. Jesus was from Galilee. Most of his apostles were from Galilee. So all of them were from Galilee. And so when Pilate learned that Jesus was Galilean, and because Herod was there because of the feast, in other words, Herod wasn't generally in Judea, but Herod came to Judea because the Herodians were Jewish. Herod came to Jerusalem for the feast of the Jews that was taking place for the Passover, and because of that, Herod Antipas was in Judea. And so Herod thought, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ship Jesus over to Herod Antipas, okay? And so he ships him over to Herod Antipas. And Herod was happy. Herod was glad to do that. Because Herod, this Herod is, this is the Herod that beheaded John the Baptist. This is the same guy. Okay, this is the Herod that beheaded John the Baptist. And so Herod, though, he wanted to meet Jesus because he wanted to see a sign or a miracle. He's hoping to see Jesus do something. And he questioned him at some length, but Jesus answered him nothing. And the chief priests and the scribes were standing there, accusing him vehemently. And Herod, with his soldiers, after treating him with contempt and mocking him, dressing him in a gorgeous robe, and sending him back to Pilate. Pilate became friends with one another that very day, for before they had been enemies with each other. They've been opposed. They're in two different regions, two different areas. And yet that day they became friends. So he sends him to Herod Antipas, who had jurisdiction. King Herod, we might say, but he was only king or had that because Rome allowed him to have that. He wasn't because he had conquered it or taken it over. It's because Rome would give him that authority. And that's Herod Antipas that comes into play here a little bit. So Herod's going to send him back. Jesus makes no defense, and Herod sends him back. You know, the one thing that you get out of all this for you and me and Herod and Pilate and Annas and Caiaphas and all of them is that when Jesus steps into your life, things get really complicated, right? What are you going to do with him, you know? That's the question we have to ask ourselves a lot of times. You know, if Jesus never stepped into your life, if you never had to deal with the question of Jesus Christ, life's a little simpler. But once Jesus steps into your life, into who you are, into your being, once you acknowledge that Jesus exists, then all of a sudden it becomes a lot more complicated. What do you do with him? Do you believe him? Do you not believe him? Do you submit to his will, to what he wants you to do, or do you choose not to? Do you base your eternity on the belief that he died and was resurrected, or do you reject that and turn away from it? You know, these questions all come into play in this trial as Jesus steps into Pilate's life. You know, more than anybody else in the story, it was Pilate who had the ability, Pilate who had the authority to set him free or to crucify him. The life of Jesus Christ, our Savior, rested in the hands of Pilate. Pilate, not a Jew, not a Christian, a Gentile, a Roman. Someone who really had no vested interest in it except he didn't want to upset the Jews. All of a sudden, Pilate's life became so complicated. It was one of those mornings, I think, that Pilate wished he had just maybe stayed in bed, right? Because this day was going to be a bad day for everybody involved. And I think that we see this as we start looking at it. You know, Isaiah 53 said, as a lamb led to its slaughter, so he did not open his mouth. And for the most part, that's true. He never responded to Herod. In all the synoptic gospels, we looked earlier at Luke, the very beginning. He said this very same statement. Says this in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. This is the only statement he says. We look at the letters I read in the Bible, the letters where Jesus spoke. And when you look at this trial before Pilate, this time he goes before the governor, in all the Gospels, all the synoptics, these are the only letters in red. Jesus didn't defend himself. Jesus didn't say he was innocent. Jesus didn't say that he shouldn't be killed or that it wasn't his fault. Jesus didn't talk back against those that were accusing him. Jesus' one statement is, it is as you say. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Are you the king of the Jews? You know, that's not something Jesus ever answered directly very much in the whole Bible. He always put it off. He always made them make that decision. Who do you say that I am? Who do people say that I am? What do you think? But this is one time in the Bible when Jesus responded. Doesn't happen very often. Woman at the well, Jesus admitted to being the Messiah. In John, it's not something Jesus did much. And he says, it's as you say. And while he was being accused, the chief priests and the elders did not answer. He did not answer. And Pilate said, you not hear how many things they testify against you? And he did not answer him with regard to even a single charge. So the governor was quite amazed. Didn't answer him, didn't respond. You know, when you read Isaiah 53 and you read that passage, As a sheep before its shears is silent, so he did not open his mouth. You know, when you talk about prophecy, messianic prophecy about Jesus, this is part of this where this starts to transform. You start to see these prophecies coming to life in what Jesus did. The hardest thing for him to do would have been not to respond, not to say anything, and yet that's exactly what he did. We got to go to Matthew, though. Matthew gives us some things that none of the other Gospels give us. They give us a little bit of the supernatural, don't you? Matthew 27. You know, this is something we think about. Pilate's wife. The wife who was vexed over Jesus, vexed over what was going on. The wife who came to Pilate. Why was sitting on the... We don't get this any place but Matthew. Matthew gives us a couple of pieces that Mark and Luke, John don't give us. In Matthew 27, he said, while I was sitting on the judge's seat, his wife sent him a message saying, have nothing to do with that righteous man. I love what she says. You know, have you had one of those dreams? Have you ever had, you know, I've had these dreams. Have you had one of those dreams where you thought it was real? You know, I hate them dreams. I have those sometimes. I had a dream about 6 months before my sister died. I had this dream. I woke up, I was crying. Susie goes, what's wrong with you? I go, my sister died. She goes, no, your sister's alive. She goes, you need to call her. So I called her up and said, I had a dream you died. It's probably something you shouldn't tell somebody. I really don't know about that. But I had this dream, and it was so powerful. It was so real. I really believed she was gone. And 6 months later, she was. I don't know what that means. I'm not a person that thinks about that much. But 6 months later, she was gone. You know, when my stepfather passed away, he was in Maine, working in Maine, and Shannon was a baby. She was about 3 years old, 4 years old, I can't remember. And she was still sleeping in a little bed beside our bed, one of the little toddler beds. We hadn't quite banished her to her room yet. That was coming in a year or two, but she was still sleeping there. And about 3 in the morning, she stood up and she goes, Papa, Papa. And me and Susie woke up, and then at 8 o'clock, my mom knocked on the door, and she says, George passed away in Maine. You know, I don't know about these things. I don't speculate about these things. But I know these dreams and how they can vex you. And that was her. And she didn't say she just had a dream. She didn't say, I had a dream, I had a premonition. But what did she know about Jesus? But what did she say? She said, I suffered greatly in a dream. You know, this wasn't an ordinary dream, this wasn't one of those things that was in passing. She suffered greatly in the dream. And she says, don't have anything to do with this man. And yet Pilate wasn't going to listen to her, was he? But Pilate, he didn't want to do it. He wanted it to be somebody else, anybody else but him. Would you want to do that? Even thinking possibly maybe Jesus was the Son of God, maybe he was really indeed the King of Israel, the Messiah that come into the world. Would you want to be the one to condemn him to a cross or condemn him to death? I wouldn't want to do that. Pilate didn't want to do that. Pilate felt backed into a corner, compelled to do what the Jews wanted him to do. And Pilate, in this symbolic act in Matthew, Pilate says, what shall I do with him? They said, crucify him. You know, Pilate thought, boy, if I beat him, if I treat him bad, I beat him, and they'll relent, they'll change their mind. But it didn't work. It didn't work. They were intent upon it. There's a mob mentality. Crucify him. And he said, what has he done? What evil? What bad thing? And they kept shouting the more. You know, John tells us that the Jews were outside during this because it was the feast, it was the Passover, and the Jews wouldn't go into a Gentile house because it defiled them for the Passover. So they were outside. So Pilate was running back and forth on this deal. Pilate was going inside, talk to Jesus, going back outside, talk to the Jews. He was in the praetorium, they call it, in this place. Pilate was questioning Jesus. Pilate would go out and talk to the Jews, and the Jews were outside. The Jews were the mass in the street. And I don't know, Jesus probably couldn't see them, but he could hear them. And I've often wondered in this story of the crucifixion, I've often wondered how many of those people standing in the street saying, crucify him, how many of those people Jesus had fed? How many of those people Jesus had healed? How many of those people Jesus had touched their life? And yet doubt didn't mean anything, did it? Now it was all, it seemed, for nothing. You know, life for us is sometimes that way, isn't it? We could do a lot of good things, but sometimes we mess up once, and it's all that matters, isn't it? That's all people can remember. That's all people can think about is our one mistake, our one mess up. They don't think about everything that we did good, everything we did right, everything we did that helped. They think about that one bad thing. That defines us, doesn't it? It becomes our identity. You know, with Jesus, it seemed like all the good didn't matter anymore. All the people he had healed, all the people he had fed, didn't matter anymore. Didn't make any difference. Didn't sway anybody's opinion. And when Jesus heard them out there crying in the street, don't you think he heard voices? Maybe voices he recognized, people that he knew. And when Pilate saw he was accomplishing anything, he washed his hands in front of it, didn't he? We say that, we use that expression, don't we? I'll wash my hands of this. He washed his hands. I'm innocent, but was he? Jesus said, those who bring me here, those who condemn me have the greater guilt. But he didn't say that Pilate was without guilt. You know, Pilate had a choice, a decision. We all have a decision when Jesus steps into our life, what we do with him. And yet Pilate, you can't get away from it. No decision is a decision when it comes to Jesus. Just a fact of life. No decision is a decision. The decision not to do anything is just as much a decision as to do something. And yet Pilate chose to do nothing. Who is he? That was Pilate's question. Who are you? If you're really God's son, why don't you show us? Why don't you do something great? Herod, why don't you do a sign? Why don't you help yourself? If you really are a king, then why do you put up with this? You know, Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't help us much with this. We really got to go to John. You know, John is the guy who gives us this discourse. Nobody else gives this to us but John. And it's one of the most powerful discourses of Christ, I believe, in the entire Bible. It's in John 18. Pilate entered again, because like I said, he's going back and forth here. He's going back and forth. Jews are outside, Jesus is inside. He's going back and forth. He asked him directly, are you the king of the Jews? And Jesus, as Jesus does, answers a question with a question. He's the master of that, isn't he? He said, are you saying this on initiative, or did others tell you about me? And Pilate answers, I'm not a Jew, am I? What difference does it make to me? Pilate says. Your own nation delivered you. What have you done? Jesus answered, maybe one of the greatest statements of the entire Bible. Jesus says, this is why I do it. This is who I am. This is what this is about. He says, my kingdom is not of this world. You don't have to worry about me, Pilate. Caesar doesn't have to be concerned about me. That's why I'm not fighting. That's why I'm not, because my kingdom's not from here. My kingdom's not of this world. If it was, my servants would be fighting. Peter tried to fight. Peter cut off Malchus's ear. They all wanted to go to war. I believe Judas's motivation was to make Jesus rise up and fight. But he says, my kingdom is not of this realm. And Pilate says, so you are a king. Jesus says, you say correctly. For this I have been born, for this I have come into the world, to testify for the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. You know, John gives us something that none of the gospel writers do. They give us this discourse between Pilate and Jesus. Like I said, the Jews are outside on the street. Jesus is in there with Pilate. They're having this conversation. And then Pilate Pilate has to make a decision. So Pilate says, guess what? I'll give you somebody else. Right? It was a custom at the Feast of the Jews, the Bible says, on Passover, to release a prisoner. Jesus said, I'll give you this guy, this Barabbas, this murderer and this revolutionary. Would you take him or would you take Jesus? Do you know what the word Barabbas, do you know what that name means? It means son of the Father. I never knew that. It means son of the Father. So Jesus was saying, do you want me to give you the Son of God or the Son of the Father? It's almost a play on words, isn't it? Who do you want me to release to you? It's really a play on terminology. He committed murder. This guy's a murderer in an uprising. And the crowd came up and asked Pilate to do for them what he usually did. And he gave him Barabbas, didn't he? You know, in the Bible, we say, in Isaiah, it says that he bore our iniquities, took our place. Barabbas lived because Jesus died. We don't ever think about that, do we? Barabbas lived because Jesus died. He was paid for with a price. His life, I don't know if that made any difference to him. I don't know if he was such a hardened criminal, such a bad guy that it didn't matter. But you know, Jesus gave his life for him. You know, Jesus says, greater love hath no man than this, that he laid down his life for a friend. But how great of love if you lay down your life for somebody who's not even your friend. Barabbas became the first substitution, if you want to look at it that way, that Jesus ever made by giving his life so another could live. Jesus gave his life so that you may live. It's that simple. Why did Jesus go to a cross? So that a murderer and a thief and a revolutionary could live. Somebody who didn't deserve it. Just like you and I don't deserve it. We don't think much about Barabbas. I wonder about him sometimes. Did it matter to him? Did it mean anything to him that Jesus died for him? You know, the world's full of a lot of people, and they don't care that Jesus died for them. It doesn't mean anything to them. But for some of us, it means everything. That Jesus died for us. So we scourged him. Maybe once, maybe twice. To be honest, I studied this till I'm tired of studying it. I don't have an answer. It kind of looks like twice. But maybe not. And John, Pilate scourged him. They twisted together a crown of thorns. We saw this. It's terrible, isn't it? Awful, unbelievable. They called it a half death because most people didn't live through it. Scourged him. They thought it would change their mind, but it didn't. Put a crown of thorns on his head, a purple robe around him. Behold the man. Maybe by this time you couldn't even recognize the man anymore. But it was just the beginning of the end, wasn't it? I have a hard time imagining all of this happening. The Via Dolorosa, they call it in Latin, the way of sorrows. They took Jesus, therefore, John says, another little indiscrepancy in the text, if you want to look at it that way. They took Jesus, therefore, and he went out bearing his own cross to the place called the place of a skull, which is Hebrew, Golgotha. In Mark 15, they pressed into service a passerby coming from the country, Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to bear his cross. Jesus came out and maybe carried his own cross to start with, is the thing we think, and was unable to carry it because of his wounds, because of his blood loss, was unable to carry it. And so they pressed Simon into service to carry the cross of Jesus. And when I thought about this morning, I thought about Jesus saying, we shall carry our cross, aren't we? Pick up our cross and carry it. If you don't carry your cross and follow him, you can't be part of him. And I thought Simon literally was the first person to pick up a cross and follow Jesus. And we think that Simon stayed faithful. There's a lot of stuff about Simon. Google him. A lot of stuff about Simon traditionally. Who Simon was, what Simon did. And that's as far as I'm taking you today, because I can't take it. It's just too much. So next week, we'll talk a little more about this and about the cross and the things that were said on the cross and the fulfillment of prophecy and all these things that come into play when we talk about the crucifixion, or this day, the day that will live in infamy, right? You know, it's funny, all this has happened. He's been arrested, he's been denied, he's been tried 4 times, he's been beaten, he's been scourged, he's had a crown of thorns placed on him, he's been condemned to die, and he's picked up his cross. And you know what? According to the Bible, it ain't even 9 o'clock in the morning yet. You think you've had some long days. Yeah, this is a real deal. Thanks for your attention this morning. If we can help you in any way, won't you let it be known while we stand and sing.